Hello everyone, we are back with another video as per usual. Last time we went over liberation within women in the LGBTQ community, and now we will be focusing on Nixon and the Vietnam War, plus a few other things that happened a little bit after, or during, however you want to classify it. So let's get started. When it comes to the Vietnam War, President Lyndon B. Johnson and Richard Nixon took very different paths, but both faced one massive challenge: how to end a war that never seemed to end. President Lyndon Johnson escalated U.S. involvement in Vietnam in the mid-1960s. He increased American troop presence, believing that war-stopping communism in the Southeast Asia was critical to U.S. credibility during the Cold War. But at home, Americans grew increasingly divided. The anti-war movement surged, especially among young people. Johnson's party, the Democrats, began to fracture, and by 1968, the war and public unrest had become too much to handle. Johnson chose not to run for re-election. Enter Richard Nixon. Elected in 1968, Nixon saw himself as a political bridge. Not quite right, not quite left. He appealed to what he called the silent majority. Americans who didn't protest, who didn't scream in the streets, but wanted law, order, and an end to the war on American terms. Nixon promised to end the war, but with peace and honor. That meant no surrender, and definitely no helicopter on the roof moment. He introduced a strategy called Vietnamization, pulling out American troops and shifting the fighting to the South Vietnamese. But while American casualties dropped, the fighting didn't stop, and in some places, it got even worse. In 1970, Nixon authorized the secret invasion of Cambodia, aiming to destroy Viet Cong supply lines. When news got out, campuses across the U.S. exploded in outrage. At Kent State University, National Guardsmen fired on student protesters, killing 4 and wounding 11. Less than 2 weeks later, 2 more students were killed at Jackson State College in Mississippi. Over 450 campuses closed. The spring semester of 1970 was, for many, canceled by protests. And then, the world learned about My Lai. Back in 1968, U.S. soldiers had massacred nearly 500 Vietnamese civilians, women, children, the elderly, in the village of My Lai. The army tried to keep it quiet, but a journalist uncovered the truth. Only one soldier, Lieutenant William Calley, was convicted. Many veterans saw him as a scapegoat. In protests, some returned their combat medals at the Capitol, tossing them onto the steps. One shouted, "Here's my merit badge for murder." Meanwhile, Nixon had a global strategy. He sought detente, or easing tensions with communist powers. He made history by visiting China and the Soviet Union, hoping to use diplomacy to pressure North Vietnam at the peace talks. By opening doors to both Moscow and Beijing, Nixon hoped to create a better exit from Vietnam, one that preserved U.S. power and dignity. So how did Nixon differ from Johnson? While Johnson escalated the war and lost support, Nixon used diplomacy, troop withdrawals, and appeals to the silent majority to try and end the war on U.S. terms, even as the anti-war movement grew louder. Understanding Nixon's Vietnam strategy means understanding both the global chessboard and the furious protests at home. So, important to keep in mind, not everyone loved what Nixon was doing, especially when they found out about My Lai and everything like that, but at the same time, he was aiming to pull out of Vietnam. Thank you for paying attention. A lot of information pretty fast. Again, I have no clue what I'm going to talk about in my next video, but I'll sure figure it out. Hopefully have a great day, and I will see you soon.